All right, Hunter, you claim the president of El Salvador is a dictator. The fact checkers have come to a verdict, and that is false. There's no legal classification of a dictator. He was elected, and El Salvador remains a democracy.
If you saw this video from Jubilee, someone said that Bukele, the president of El Salvador, was a dictator, and the fact checkers determined that that was not true, citing that he had been elected twice. Now, the definition of a dictator is highly subjective, but I think it needs to be understood that being elected does not mean that you're not a dictator. As of 2026, El Salvador is considered by some people to be a hybrid regime, where you have a democracy gradually transitioning to an authoritarian state, or vice versa. The El Salvadorian government has been repeatedly criticized for what's called democratic backsliding, which is also a common indication of something turning into a dictatorship over time. Dictatorships tend to form over time through democratic backsliding. Usually you have a charismatic leader, and they say that they need to increase security in order to fight crime. They also tend to change the constitution to align with their interests, doing things like eliminating specific checks and balances, eliminating term limits, and expanding their own powers, things that El Salvador's government has done within the past 5 years. It's also quite common for dictatorships to still hold elections, mainly to maintain the appearance of democracy, while also looking for potential opposition or dissidents. For instance, in 2025, in the Cameroonian election, the opposition candidate eventually fled the country for his own safety. The president of Cameroon has been in power for decades, and it's largely considered an autocracy or dictatorship. In the case of Russia in 2024's election, there's a candidate named Boris Nadezhdin, and he was barred from running because his signatures were declared fraudulent. In 2026, he tried running in the Russian Duma, and then he was then labeled a foreign agent and again rejected as a candidate. In the case of Bukele in El Salvador, there are some concerning signs of democratic backsliding which could lead to a transition into a full-on dictatorship. For instance, Bukele has been known for attacking the press and attempting to censor them. In 2020, a publication known as El Faro claimed that he was negotiating with MS-13. In response to this, Bukele had El Faro investigated for money laundering, and later on El Faro moved its headquarters to Costa Rica. The Legislative Assembly of El Salvador, which has a supermajority under Bukele's party, has also passed laws in 2022 that allow for the jailing and imprisonment of journalists for up to 15 years, depending on how they report on gang activity. In February of 2020, before he had a supermajority in the Legislative Assembly, Bukele called for a special session because he was trying to secure a $109 million loan. At that special session, he sent 40 troops into the building to intimidate the lawmakers. However, this was not successful. In 2021, Bukele's party, Nuevas Ideas, won a supermajority in the Legislative Assembly. One of the first things that they did was replace the Attorney General and the 5 justices on the Supreme Court of Justice's Constitutional Court. One of the reasons for this was that at the time, under the El Salvador Constitution, a president could not serve consecutive terms. However, later that year, they determined that Bukele could run for re-election, which he did in 2024. And in 2025, the Legislative Assembly eliminated term limits for presidents. They expanded the presidential term from 5 years to 6 years, and they also changed to a first-past-the-post system as opposed to a 2-round voting system. Under the previous 2-round voting system, if you didn't have a majority of votes in the election, then you had to vote a second time until someone reached a majority. However, now it's a first-past-the-post system, which means that anyone who receives the most votes simply wins. Now, a major reason behind the popularity of Bukele in El Salvador has been his work to reduce violence in the country, especially homicides, which I believe is true. However, according to investigative journalist Celia Medrano, there is a point of concern in that the actual homicide rate isn't publicly accessible. She says right here, ¿Cómo verificar las cifras de Bukele? Imposible. No hay acceso público a un registro confiable oficial de homicidios diarios en el país. Y más, la muerte en las cárceles de personas detenidas durante el régimen de excepción no son tomadas en cuenta en los números anunciados como homicidios por el gobierno, which is saying that any deaths recorded while incarcerated are not listed as homicides, even though they very well could be. So on the one hand, I understand why Jubilee made its decision because dictator is a subjective term, and Bukele doesn't quite meet that classification. But also, the signs indicate that he is heading towards that direction because we're seeing an expansion of presidential powers, consolidation of power itself, the elimination of term limits, the usage of emergencies to again seize more power, and also things such as attacking journalists, which are all signs that a country is shifting towards an authoritarian regime.